Awakened Living is a 21st century movement for people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, who have a deep hunger for connected community and a divine impulse for personal and global transformation. Our mission is to encourage and inspire the awakening of human consciousness. Good evening. Welcome to Awakened Living Television. My name is TJ Woodward. I'm the minister and spiritual director of Awakened Living and also the author of the new book, Conscious Being. I am so delighted that you've chosen to be here on our show with us this evening. Awakened Living, if you don't know, Awakened Living Television was started about 3 years ago now. I had a very clear intention of bringing on guests of diverse backgrounds to have a conversation or conversations about spirituality in the 21st century. And if the word spirituality doesn't work, we could say living our most dynamic life or living our life to the fullest. So I am so excited this evening that one of my favorite people of all time, and I can say that with sincerity, is back with us this evening. We have Lori Jean Glass back on the show. She was a guest on the show probably about a year ago, and I feel like our conversation had just begun at that point. Lori Jean is the director of Five Sisters Ranch, which is a residential treatment program for women. I'm going to let her tell more about that. But really, the reason I'm so delighted is I just love being in conversation with Lori Jean about really just about anything. So we are going to talk about discernment this evening. And I'm going to leave it just that broad to start out. So Lori Jean, welcome back to our show. I'm so happy you're here. So before we begin, why don't you take a couple of minutes to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your work for those who don't know you.
Great. Hi, I'm Lori Jean, and I am the director at Five Sisters Ranch. And we actually work with women that have relationship challenges stemming from love addiction, love avoidance, codependency, trauma, anxiety, depression. We just work with helping women find their true self and feel better about being in relationship.
Wow, well, I am so excited about this conversation, and I want to, before we even get into the conversation, speak to my experience of Five Sisters and the profound work that you do there and the profound work that your team does there. I am really, I can't say really enough, moved really by the depth of commitment to helping women at a time in their life where they may be very confused or feel very lost. And we've had the opportunity to work directly with some clients together. And I'm so grateful for the work you do. And it feels like you are doing something at Five Sisters Ranch that, I don't want to say no one else is doing it, but you're doing it in a way that's so grounded and so present and so powerful. I've seen some really remarkable results from the work that you do. So I want to begin with thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that. And we do.
Yeah.
We do just that. It's really about helping women, really come home and be able to, clear up all of those wounds that happen in relationship. And in today's world, so many people are faced with, death and lots of trauma and adultery and, just acting out because they're uncomfortable with feelings.
Yeah, and you do work with such a beautiful cross-section of people at different places in their life. And I know you kind of gave the overview with codependency, love addiction, and love avoidant. I don't know, before we talk about discernment, which is our topic, maybe we could talk a little bit about those different categories, I guess, if you will.
Definitely.
Why someone would come to Five Sisters.
Sure, yeah. Usually we get calls from women that are in a crisis because of relationships. And they may have gone through a primary treatment center and realize they're not ready to go home because they're walking into having to repair and restore a relationship, not knowing even how to begin that, right? So they might be married to someone who's addicted to porn and is acting out kind of love avoidantly, avoiding the primary relationship in order to not have to deal with their feelings, or it can be just they have a tremendous amount of anxiety because they just found out that, their oldest child is addicted to meth, or, they wake up one morning and realize that they're not in love with the person they've been married to for 20 years and they don't really know what to do about that. So, we see women that typically come from that place of struggling with either attachment disorder, is why they're having challenges later in life with relationships, or they themselves are addicts and treat relationships like they did their addiction to food or alcohol or drugs. And we also see people that have had, some complex trauma or even just trauma in general. I mean, we don't really have to differentiate between complex and trauma. It's all traumatic, right?
Yeah.
So,
and one of the things that I love that you do at Five Sisters so beautifully, because I also work in intensive outpatient, specifically or more with the chemical dependency component. So often, as you know, of course, when people remove or stop that primary addiction, or what we might call the primary addiction,
right,
there's this could be secondary, and oftentimes it actually is the primary addiction, and the drugs or the alcohol are actually more of a coping mechanism or a way to deal with some of this unresolved trauma or these relational issues that haven't ever been addressed. And what I love about what you do is you take people, maybe they have completed their 30 or 60 days in chemical dependency treatment, and then this next layer is so clear and so obvious,
That's right.
but you do it in such a way that is so powerful and provide a space and a healing environment that I've just never really witnessed anything quite like it.
Thanks. I think part because we're so small,
Yeah.
With only having 6 women. And, I know our topic today is discernment. And, leading into that, it's a great way to explain kind of what we do, because when women come in, they have this wound, right? And like I said earlier, it comes from either attachment or trauma or addiction usually, right? And then what they do with that wound is they feel. Every time they feel that wound, they start feeling. And then in order to tolerate those feelings, they have to act out.
Yeah.
They have to do something to not feel. And what we help teach them to do is discern between, instead of acting out, how to have relational living. Right? So how can they live life and be relational without feeling like they have to act out in order to not just tolerate, but live with and manage those feelings that come up, that get triggered by pain bodies?
Yeah, and I want to ask you to expand upon a theme of what we do with these kind of intense triggers or pains, what, activating this pain body. But there's such a large school of thought out there that teaches us how to remove the pain. And I know that you're doing something very different.
Right.
And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is discern what pain we're removing, right? Because I'm a recovering love addict, right? And my father drowned when I was little, and my mom, committed suicide basically from alcoholism when I was a teenager. And so that unmet longing that I talk about a lot, came from a place of me wanting to have relationship so intensely later as an adult that I would mistake an intensity for intimacy. So that wound for me needed to be having somebody meet me in my intensity and starting there. Whereas with some people, they need to be met maybe in their depression, or maybe they need to be met in their anxiety, or whatever it is, it's getting diagnosed. I think we need to go underneath that and be really clear about making it individualized in a way where people can really have their own set of tools to be able to move out of that.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you talk about going under rather than the idea of looking at a symptom that needs to be removed. And having worked in this field in many different programs, there is at least one, collective school of thought that it's about looking at the symptomology and then finding a way to remove it. And I know that you're doing something, to me, that's much deeper and more profound, which is looking underneath that.
Right. So we do a lot of stuff around survival patterns, like really, really looking at not just how they feel, but what they did with what they feel, right? So a woman comes into Five Sisters Ranch and she's having an affair, right? And we look at her child, we look at her teen, and we look at her unhealthy adult. And what we find out is when she was a child, she was scared most of the time and afraid because she didn't know what was going to happen. And so she would sneak food in the kitchen in the middle of the night as a child. Well, that secretive behavior carried through most of her life. She started sneaking drugs and alcohol when she was a teen. And then when she got married, she had a lot of guilt around what was good about life, right? Not deserving, I'm not worthy, I'm not enough. And so she looked to this secretive behavior as an outlet that was familiar for her. So what to the outside world looked like it was, so horrific, which it is. I'm not saying it's not. It is. However, we have to go underneath and see, why is she so comfortable with that behavior? Because if we just give her a book about infidelity, that book is not going to speak directly to her story of sneaking food when she was a child.
Yeah. And those mechanisms that we find early on, to me, it's like I look at, like in my own individual journey and in clients that I work with, it's like, and you and I have had this conversation about, I call it brilliant strategies, and I know you use different terminology.
Right.
But the reason I say that is we find some way to survive it. And then that survival becomes a way of seeking safety, or what I think is safety.
That's right.
And that it's so maladaptive. I wake up one day and think, wow, this very thing that I thought was saving me actually is preventing me from experiencing.
But it's organic. I mean, it is real. It is real as I'm sitting here breathing. When you learn to use those behaviors as a way to comfort yourself, you're not growing up thinking, oh, this isn't good. Right. You're growing up with, this is what I need to live. This is how I need to survive.
Yes.
So it gets really intense, and that discerning piece, is so cool, because, teaching somebody how to discern between, judging and discerning of what needs to be done in those moments. I mean, that's a high spiritual calling.
Yeah. To
have discernment and look at the greater good in the whole perspective. Relationships, if we're just talking about, relationships today, that's a tall order. Looking at the whole perspective. And what I mean by that is, what we do is we help people look at themselves, how they feel physically, emotionally, intellectually, financially, and spiritually. Yeah. And discerning over how to live from that place, as opposed to just emotional and physical connections, because that's what people do. Most people connect physically and emotionally.
Yeah, and for many people, obviously people that have trauma, whether we call it complex or trauma, there is an abandonment, right? There's an abandoning of self. So I may not have any sense, like I'm so far removed from knowing what's actually happening within me, that I'm looking for this external, and maybe that's classic addiction. Like I'm looking for something outside of myself to feel safe or comfortable. The process, I'm curious how you frame or how you work with someone that comes into your program that has abandoned themselves at such an early age, how to integrate or to really begin to have a relationship with self.
Well, it's different. It depends on how they were abandoned, who abandoned them, all of that. I think that the first step is just getting to a place of looking at the abandonment, right? They can't have a relationship with themselves until they understand clearly what that abandonment wound is all about. And then when they start looking at self, what we're usually faced with is a tremendous amount of shame.
Yes.
Like David Hawkins, I love his map of consciousness, and the lowest calibrated energy, which is my field of study, is shame. And that's why Brene Brown is talking so much about shame, and people are identifying so much with the Daring Greatly movement, and it's really true. It's like, you got to meet them there. Like, we can't get somebody to start doing positive affirmations right away. And that's kind of the beauty of what we do, is we let them fall apart and sit in that and know that, wow, I'm still here. I'm still, I remember sitting in my bed the first time I decided not to be in relationship, when I was healing my love addiction. And I had to really learn to be alone first before I could start liking Lori Jean. I didn't even know Lori Jean alone, because I'd never been alone, because I was so terrified of being alone because of the abandonment. Most people that are abandoned never feel alone, because they're always putting something in that hole to not feel alone.
Right. And I love that what you talked about with the affirmations, because it's just a variation of what I'm referring to about with looking at like the symptoms and the solution to that symptom without getting down to this underlying core shame. It's not actually the very core, but that core shame sense, and being able to be in a space where we can get to that.
Right.
And
That's
rest in that for a while, because for most of us and for most people that come out of trauma or traumatic backgrounds, obviously, I feel like if I experience this scary, dark place, it's going to kill me.
That's right. So you'll do anything to not feel that.
Including affirmations. Right? And then, and then how effective is that?
Well, it's also, I remember when I started looking at discernment, it's a word that came to me through a spiritual journey that I started when I was starting my own healing process, right? From having and gone through some complex trauma as a child. So I start this healing process, and I start wanting to go down a spiritual path. And I lean into that a little bit, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I'm not worthy again. That I'm not worthy. Like, I don't trust this because I didn't trust anything, so that was too high of a leap for me. So I had to abandon that spiritual path for a little while until I could discern when I'm in something good between what's really there for me and what do I need to do in order to stay on that path.
Yeah.
And, it's almost like the old, I don't like to use like good versus bad or right versus wrong, because it seems so black and white, But the truth of the matter is when you're discerning, you're basically thinking, which way to go. This is a choice that I have. And I could either go a spiritual route and start getting some cleansing in that direction, or I could go right back into old addictive patterns that were clearly going to take me out. And it's in those crossroad moments, where I think we have our greatest awakenings, when we have to kind of step back and discern and tolerate that uncomfortableness while we're discerning which way to go. That's kind of how I look at discernment. I think it's every day. It's right in front of us.
Yeah, wow, you brought up some incredible
granola
points.
or Fruit Loops.
Yeah, granola or Fruit Loops. That's a great metaphor. Yeah, of course. If I've had Fruit Loops all my life, of course I'm going to choose that. I love I love everything that you just said, but a couple things that stood out. One is, for me, being the spiritual director of Awakened Living, I'm very clear that I do not want to create a community that doesn't involve integrating the shadow. Because so much spirituality out there is about spirituality out there. It's about, finding a way to not feel in a way. It's through
spiritual bypass.
Thank you, spiritual bypass, which is, I write a little bit about that in my book, that because I jumped right onto that, of course, at one point in my life. I found a teaching that was all about, let me do some positive affirmations, because I didn't want to look. I didn't want to feel the intensity of the shame that was driving my life. Yeah. And it worked until it didn't work. And then, of course, it was still waiting for me, and even with more intensity. Right. So I so appreciate that you talked about that piece to me now, that is the spiritual journey. And of course, Brene Brown and a lot of people are talking about shame. John Bradshaw's been talking about it for quite some time. That's right. As part of the spiritual path, and he's the theologian. Shame
that binds us. Yep.
Yeah.
That's right.
But I want to go back to choice and talk about choice, because really discernment and choice are.
Right, and that comes in the way of relationships, right? Yeah. I think it's best understood if we just talk about relationships, right? And having discernment around what we do. I think first and foremost, we need to understand the relationships we're in. Like so many people, again, want to either be in or out of relationships and not really understand that they can discern between different levels of being relational. And one of the things we do at Five Sisters is we teach what we call the circle boundaries. And it is giving 5 different levels of being relational. Because when you can discern about what to disclose, what not to disclose, that can make or break a relationship. When you can discern about how much time to spend with someone or not, that can make or break a relationship, right? Especially if you're new in recovery and you're trying to tolerate feelings and you've got some challenges within your own family dynamics, then having discernment around what family members to bring in and how close do you bring them makes or breaks your recovery. I think that discernment, at an elementary level is so crucial to understand.
Yeah.
So that people can make that choice. Because I'm not going to sit there and go, okay, give me a moment. I got to discern about whether or not I want to spend 20 more minutes with you, right? It's not like that. But what I can do is I can internally go inside and go, I'm not feeling really comfortable. So I think the best choice for me right now is to probably wrap this up and exit stage left, right? And that to me is like everyday discernment.
Yeah. And that is the recovery process, right? Because for many people, I know for me and many of the clients I work with, that choice has been abandoned. In other words, I don't even know I'm choosing, right? So the unconscious is choosing everything. And I'm not able to understand what that feeling deep inside of me means and know that, wow, something's not right here, even though we might not want to use right and wrong, but not right for me in this moment. Not comfortable.
It's not comfortable, right? And if you're uncomfortable in a relationship, it's important to take a look at that. And if it's somebody that's close to you, when do you learn and how do you learn to have discernment around using your voice? When do you speak to it? When do you not speak to it? When is somebody available to really listen to you? And are they available to really listen to you? All of that. There's so much that goes behind that, with choosing of how to be in relationship. And that's kind of what we do second week up at Five Sisters, is really helping people role play and go out and list every single person they're going to go home and be in relationship with. And then how are you going to show up for that relationship? What do you need to discern around how you need to be? Because if we just leave with a set of boundaries, we feel like we need to go buy a straitjacket.
Right.
And I'm all about the boundary, And all about the base.
Learning how to not only, trust is a whole other level of trusting that, but even learning to know that exists. And that I'm referring to is that inner knowing, that inner gnawing, that inner yes or no, or that guidance system. Because obviously for people who have been in relationship addictions or substance addictions, we've often abandoned that.
And we're going to.
Yeah.
We're going to. That's the beauty of it. We are going to. And especially, if we have deep wounds. I love Eckhart Tolle's pain body. I talk about that a lot. And if you have a pain body wound, I have a pain body wound of abandonment. So I know that if I'm going to be in relationship with somebody that is going to continually abandon me, then I need to be very clear about what I'm going to do with that relationship. Or I'm going to choose to keep hurting myself. So the choice there, the discernment is, I really like that person. I want to hang out with that person, but that person's not going to be what I call a good friend because they're not going to be capable of that, especially if I've given them an invitation to step into that and they can't do it. I don't want to take them hostage. I don't want to make them bad. I want to continue to love them. So I have to have discernment around what they're able to bring to the table as opposed to getting judgmental and getting angry and pissed off that they can't show up for me.
Yeah, because that's the crazy-making piece, right? If they would just change, I would be okay.
That's
I know you're talking about something very different. I have a kind of a question.
But not really.
Well, yes and no.
And that's a great way of phrasing it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So a little bit different framework on this. How would you work with someone, or how do you work with someone that has been not in a relationship, and maybe they're love avoidant, maybe not, but anyone, how do we discern someone who's working through their trauma, someone that has these wounds? They've now learned about these wounds. They've learned how to check in. I've learned how to have some discernment about who's appropriate. One big piece of discernment, and I work with clients with this a lot, is there's a big fear of getting into a relationship at all. How do we discern when it's time and how to do that in a healthy way?
Great question. And it's going to be different for everyone, right? So I would need to know history to be able to tell you what time, right? Generally speaking, we don't know when it's time. They know when it's time. We don't know when it's time. They know when it's time. And you want to work with somebody to get to that place of when they're ready. And if they're not ready, then that's the work you do, right? You go into seeing, why is that fear still coming up? What are you really afraid about showing up and revealing yourself? Learning to have your voice. Do you have it yet? I mean, this is going to sound probably silly, but I like avoidance, people that stay out of a relationship and avoid relationship, to take singing lessons. How can you show up and show parts of you that are uncomfortable? And if you're not a singer, go try take singing lessons.
Yeah.
I did that.
Yeah. You did that. You did
I
that
did
yourself.
that.
Wow. And it was an effective tool.
Pollyanna Bush, she's the best. She actually comes up to Five Sisters second week and takes our clients through the process of writing a song and singing a song, because that shows a vulnerability that you don't really even know is in there when it comes just from singing a song in front of other people, right? So I think you move them. That's why I love experiential therapy, right? Because you move them into feeling what it's like to disclose a little more of who they are. And the more they can do that, the more they can prepare themselves to be ready to show up to go into relationship. And then absolutely have a clear plan around it. Like, they need support and help. I mean, they need help as much to just help them with their smartphones. You know, what do they know about texting? What do they know about conversation? You know, are they going to be okay if they text message somebody and they don't get back in an hour? Like, have all of those conversations. If they're going to do online dating, if you have an avoidance starting to go out into relationship online, that person's going to need a tremendous amount of support and help to navigate that world. That's a whole nother conversation, by the way.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it is.
That's next show.
And it could be next show. And believe it or not, we only have a few minutes left
You're
of this
kidding.
show. And I'm not. It goes so fast every time.
Gosh.
So I'm wondering if there's just anything that maybe you would say of course, there's anything we could talk about, but is there any key point that comes up that you'd like to address around discernment, and in particular with this relational piece or in this relational conversation?
Yeah, I think really kind of to sum it up, it's just I invite people to take a look at, not making it so complex for them. Like discernment, have that be a word like you would use joy. Move into it a little more and know that can give you such relational freedom if you learn to have discernment. It's not about being negative. It's not about judging. It's really not. It's about the greater good for everyone. If we all had used good discernment and had good judgment, then I think that we'd be a lot better off relationally, because we wouldn't be hurting others, and more importantly, we wouldn't keep hurting ourselves.
Yeah.
Because hurt people, as we know.
Yeah, and we would, learn how to connect and be vulnerable and authentic with what's really going on, which always serves everybody. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of experiential groups in my work, and I do an authenticity group, and every time there's that client that is so afraid of really letting someone see who they are, and every time they do that, they always feel closer. Yeah,
that's right.
And we know that on some level, and then there's on another level, it's absolutely terrifying for you to really see me, of course, which is intimacy. So, so thank you for being on our show, and maybe we'll have you back for another show soon.
I'd love that.
Yeah, and in closing, why don't you tell our viewers how to find you, some of your web information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you can reach me at Lori@LoriJean.com. And you can reach Five Sisters Ranch at FiveSistersRanch.com. And that's it.
Okay, well, Lori Jean, thank you so much. I just loved our conversation. I always love being in conversation with you, Lori Jean, and really it feels so powerful, this deep, authentic movement that's happening now in relationships, in people who are struggling with this, and how we walk through that in such an authentic and connected way. So thank you so much for honoring us this evening and being on our show. And thank you, our viewers, for tuning in to another edition of Awaken Living Television. You can find us online at awakenlivingsf.org. Please join us for an upcoming event. Also, please check out my new book, Conscious Being. That is consciousbeingbook.com. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and good night.